This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today's conversation is with Priscilla Wald. She'll be talking about swine flu, SARS, invasion of the body snatchers, pandemics, and popular culture. Professor Wald is an expert on how people and societies react to the real and perceived threat of epidemics. She has appointments here at Duke in English and in Women's Studies. She is also affiliated with a number of campus groups, including the Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy, the Institute for Global Health, and the Trent Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities. Her most recent book is Contagious: Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative. She is the editor of the journal American Literature, and this semester here at Duke she is teaching two courses, The Cold War Culture and Evolution in Science and Culture. For everyone watching these office hours, you are invited to ask Professor Wald a question. To do that, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. Professor Wald, your office hours are normally 3 to 5 Monday afternoons, but thank you for coming in here today to hold these special online office hours. And obviously, the H1N1 virus has been keeping you busy because you study how popular media tell the stories of disease outbreaks. So, how would you describe the popular version of the swine flu story? Is it a thriller, a dud, or just fair and balanced reporting?
That's a great question. I would say in the early months of the H1N1 outbreak last spring, it was definitely a thriller. It was an outbreak narrative. It had a clear beginning in a locale that was, for people in the U.S., somewhat exotic. It was threatening to spread. We didn't know where. We didn't know how. It was a great mystery story, a detective story. What was it and where was it going? I think over time, what we've seen as it did spread, what we've seen is a much more balanced coverage. Occasionally, we'll still get the sensational outbreak story, but for the most part now, we're just getting facts and figures and hearing about the vaccine and hearing about the travels of this bug. But I think at this point, I would call it a fair and balanced story.
You say in your research, in your work, that these new communicable diseases, when they emerge, they tend to follow a certain outbreak narrative and how they're described. What is that narrative? What's the plot, the characters in it?
The plot and the characters, it usually starts in, as I said, an exotic locale, exotic from the perspective of the U.S. So it starts somewhere in a rainforest or a jungle or someplace very far away, sometimes in a tundra, in Alaska or in the North Pole or something like that, someplace quite far away. And at first it's very isolated, but there are carriers in this story. There are people who have the disease and somehow get out of the contained area and threaten to, or in fact actually bring it into the metropole. And at that point, the disease is running unchecked, and it's a race between the heroic scientists who have to figure it out, the heroic epidemiologists who want to contain it, and the disease itself that gets increasingly personified and threatens the entire species. It's very frequently an apocalyptic narrative.
Now, obviously, swine flu is not the first outbreak we've had. And in recent history, there's been SARS and concern about avian flu and, of course, the big modern disease, HIV. How would you compare and contrast the way swine flu is being described with how these other outbreaks were described?
That's a great question. Starting with HIV, I talk about HIV in my book, and I talk about it as the disease that really prompted the outbreak narrative. But the outbreak narrative is about anything but HIV. The outbreak narrative is about a disease that flares up. It's highly infectious. It's spreading out of control. I mean, HIV certainly did that, but it's spreading usually by contact, and it's very immediately devastating. So HIV, people had HIV for quite some time before they would actually show the symptoms and get full-blown AIDS. The outbreak narrative is something that is very dramatic. It's generally hemorrhagic, and so I think that it's again, it's very apocalyptic. There's an immediacy to the threat. Again, I think HIV was apocalyptic. There were certain features of the outbreak narrative, but it was not the kind of immediate threat that, in the next month, this could cover the entire terrain of a continent. That sort of language. SARS was more like that. SARS was the first the communicable disease outbreak of the 21st century, and it definitely followed the outbreak paradigm. There were carriers. There was tremendous fear around SARS. There was a lot of quarantine and a lot of uncertainty about what this was. Again, that's true of HIV too, but a lot of uncertainty about the immediacy of how this disease was going to spread.
Professor Wald, we are taking questions from people watching online, and you can do that by Facebook, by Twitter, or by email. We've got an email question here from Jeffrey, who asks, why do we need to name the pandemics such as the swine flu and Asian and Spanish flu? How does naming the pandemic impact our reaction and understanding of them?
Jeffrey, that's a great question, and I have a general answer and then an answer that's more specific to individual infections. I think the general answer is that when we name them, we feel somehow that we know who our enemy is, and we can envision it, we can begin to combat it. It somehow familiarizes the enemy in a way that this nameless thing that's happening doesn't do. I think the names, however, vary, and frequently they're named by a locale. When they're named by a locale, one of the problems is they tend to stigmatize those places. The Spanish flu, which in fact did not originate in Spain, but in Kansas. So one of the problems of that name is we begin to then stigmatize a particular place. Swine flu, people began not to eat pork, even though there was absolutely no indication and has been no indication that this could be spread by eating pork. Nonetheless, because it was named swine flu, people began to feel pork. So the names have huge consequences.
Professor Wald, we have another question here that comes by email from Ellen, and it touches on the more recent news of a coming swine flu vaccine. And Ellen cites not only H1N1 vaccine, but other vaccines and ingredients she's concerned about. She lists various websites that raise concerns about vaccines. Now, I know you're not a medical doctor giving advice about vaccines, but how do popular conceptions about vaccines and sometimes concerns get formed?
Ellen, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's another great question. What I talk about is how the way we tell the story about the diseases deeply affects the way we as a general public respond to them. So if the media is describing, for instance, the fiasco of the 1976 swine flu vaccine, the one that misfired, we could say, and they're telling it in the story about the current H1N1 vaccine, it's going to really alarm people. It's going to keep people from wanting to get that vaccine. So if the media is telling the story about the dangerous ingredients that are in the H1N1 vaccine, again, it's going to alarm people. There are some people who feel if it's FDA approved, we can easily trust it. There are other people who feel that that's a meaningless approval. What I have found when I talk to those people is their response to that usually comes down to where they read the story about the vaccine and how sensationalized it was. I do, though, want to say something else about vaccines and quarantine. And one of the things I found with the outbreak narrative is that vaccines and quarantine are the two main solutions that are presented to dealing with a raging pandemic. And both of them are tremendously important. And as you've said, James, I am definitely not a medical doctor or an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to comment on the efficacy of those things. However, one thing that is not told in that story is what I think most poignantly and powerfully fuels a pandemic, and that's poverty and lack of access to health care. And it seems to me that what is missing from the story, the sensational stories about outbreak with which we get terrified or terrify ourselves, what's missing is the possibility of stepping back and taking a bigger look, a global look, at the problem of emerging infections, infectious disease, pandemics. How are they most going to spread? What's most going to be dangerous? They're going to spread in places where poverty has made people more susceptible to illness, where they are living closer together and are more likely to infect each other and the disease is more likely to mutate, and where they don't have adequate access to health care. It is in our power as a world to begin to address that problem, and we're not doing nearly enough to do so.
Viewers are invited to ask Professor Wald a question during these office hours. To do that, post a comment to the Duke University Facebook page, or tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. Professor Wald, in your work, you identify some famous characters in outbreak narratives. Introduce us to some of these people. There's Typhoid Mary and Patient Zero.
Those are definitely two of the protagonists of my work. Typhoid Mary was a really interesting figure. She was an Irish domestic servant in the early 20th century in New York City, and she was the first identified carrier of typhoid. She was a very important figure in public health because public health officials suddenly knew or could now prove or begin to prove, they actually couldn't prove at the time she was identified, but begin to prove their theory that diseases could be spread by people who didn't look sick, people who themselves had not had the disease, people who were carriers. One of the things I talk about Mary Mallon, who became known as Typhoid Mary, was the relevance of her gender, of her ethnicity, that she was Irish, or her nationality, of her status as a domestic servant in the narrative that gets told about this figure. There were several male dairy farmers who actually spread the disease to many more people than Mary Mallon, but who were not constrained from doing their work as she was. She ended up confined to an infectious disease hospital on North Brother Island in Manhattan. And this was not done to these dairy farmers. And so it goes to show that these stories are about more than simply the medical facts or the epidemiological questions, that there's a lot of cultural and social features to this story. So that's what I've seen with Typhoid Mary. Patient Zero was another very interesting figure, and of course he was the Canadian flight attendant who was the what was called the epidemiological patient zero. That is, he was the person through which the CDC began to prove their claim. They tracked his contacts and then the sexual contacts of his contacts to begin to prove their claim that HIV was being sexually transmitted. As part of the story that gets told by Randy Schultz in his book And the Band Played On, this epidemiological patient zero, which simply means he's the person with whom the epidemiologist began to track this problem, becomes patient zero, the man who brought HIV to North America. And of course, that's absolutely demonstrably untrue, but he became demonized in the story of HIV. And those are some of the questions that I study. How and why are people demonized in the process of telling the story of disease? How are places demonized? How are populations and behaviors demonized? And that's part of the tragic story of pandemics, is that demonization.
Professor Wald, we have a question that's come in by email related to just that topic. It comes from Jeff, and he says, I noticed after the H1N1 outbreak, one of the stranger reactions was in Egypt, where all of the pigs in the country, which were mostly owned by Christian Copts, were slaughtered on the order of the government. Is it often that pandemics get tangled up in government's control over marginalized communities?
Again, that's a great question, and it speaks to some of the earlier questions as well, how we name these pandemics, or how we name the bugs, what we do as a consequence of those names. And I think it absolutely is the case that they get caught up in our cultural and social biases. I would not argue that they're part of some government plot, or that I have seen governments take advantage of a pandemic. I mean, in history, I have seen governments take advantage of an epidemic or pandemic, actually. But it's not so much that in the present day that I see as the fact that the story, the way we're narrating the problem of this disease, gets caught up in the politics and the biases of a particular place and moment. So that's a great question.
Professor Wald, when we hear about the swine flu, it's often accompanied with the medical advice to wash your hands, cover your nose and mouth when you cough. Is there any sort of social or cultural advice you'd have about how we speak about disease and outbreaks that individuals, people in the public, could adhere?
Yes, I think there is. I would caution people to be very aware of the language and even of the photographs, the pictures that are circulating about a particular disease, to be aware of how they are getting associated with locales or with particular objects or people or, again, behaviors or animals in the case of swine flu. I would really caution people to pay attention to how we are telling the stories of these diseases and to try, to the best of their ability, to separate out the important facts that the media is conveying from the more sensational stories that the media, by intention or not, are telling.
Viewers are invited to join this conversation. You can do that in one of three ways. Comment on the Duke University Facebook page, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. Professor Wald, you study not only narratives about disease outbreaks, but also other areas of science, especially genetics. Mm-hmm. So you take science fiction pretty seriously. Is that right?
I do. Not as prediction, but as commentary, as social commentary.
What are you looking for when you watch a sci-fi movie or read a sci-fi book that maybe just the regular fan is not paying attention to?
That's a good question. Maybe a complicated answer. It depends. If it's visual, I'm looking at how the images are being used, how with camera angles and close-ups, for instance, or bird's eye views or whatever, the viewer is being made to feel, the spectator is being made to feel particular things. I'm looking for the language that a science fiction writer is using in telling a story. I'm looking for familiar plot lines and devices. So, for instance, Isaac Asimov is a huge influence on many science fiction writers who came after him. So I'm looking at how those writers are using the themes and messages of Isaac Asimov, all of those kinds of things.
Professor Wald, you have been watching the TV show Heroes, an example of science fiction, and you say there's some important, interesting material in there. What is that for the Heroes fans?
I think what interests me most about Heroes is where it deviates from science. So there are very interesting stabs, you could say, at bringing science into the plot line, but I don't think science is what is most of interest for the people writing Heroes. But what fascinates me is how each character has his or her own unique mutation, which, of course, in the theory of punctuated equilibrium, if there were a sudden mutation of this kind, it would not be different. It would not express itself differently, most likely, in different individuals. So that's a plot device. It's true in XMen as well. And I find it really interesting because it allows us to explore the question of character. It allows us to explore how we associate mutation and monstrosity, really, with a fundamental question of what it means to be human, which I think is at the heart of both Heroes and XMen. So the screenwriters, the authors, et cetera, are asking the question, well, what are the boundaries and borders of what it means to be human? And if we begin to evolve and we develop individual traits that mark us as something other than human, how will other people respond? Which of those traits will be considered monstrous? Which will be considered advantageous? Which will be considered destructive? How will people who are not experiencing the mutation respond to those mutations? How will the government respond? How will we tell the story of those mutations? And I think those are tremendously important as well as fascinating questions that ask us to think about our own definitions of what it means to be human and our own explorations of difference, of monstrosity, and of anything that we would define as, you could say, abnormal.
Everyone watching these office hours is invited to ask Professor Wald a question. To do that, post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page or tweet with the tag Duke Live or send an email to live@duke.edu. Professor Wald, you brought up this issue of fundamental human questions that arise when you start looking at science, genetics, and fiction. And what are some examples of how that comes up in, say, a vampire story or an alien story?
I think, again, a great question. I think at the heart of a lot of these stories is a fundamental anxiety about evolution. And if you stop and think about it, how often do you hear people talking in serious scientific terms about human evolution, about what will come after us? That's a topic that I think makes a lot of people nervous, and I'm very curious about that. Some people find it fascinating, others find it deeply threatening because, of course, and this is what Heroes and XMen are also exploring, if we evolve a certain amount, at what point will our evolution make us something other than human, and at what point will we become a threat, not only to human beings, us, those of us who are not monstrous or mutated or special or whatever, but to the human species generally? Isn't evolution, in fact, in some sense, another word for extinction? I mean, obviously, extinction is an alternative to evolution, but evolution is a kind of extinction itself. It's a change. It's a transformation. And I think the vampire stories are very interested, again, in that question about the boundary of human and something else. Vampires are superhuman. Vampires don't live the way human beings live. Vampires are immortal unless they're killed. They don't die natural deaths. These are all things that are, I think, fantasies of human beings. We wonder what it would be like to live in that kind of world, to live in that kind of body, to live with that kind of, you could say freedom, you could say curse. It really depends how you look at it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first huge vampire story, Dracula, the one that really hit, in a popular way, that really went out into the general public, was at the end of the Victorian period and was on the heels of Charles Darwin's work. I think it's very much an exploration of the notion of human being that gets thrown into question by theories of evolution.
Professor Wald, take us into one of your classes, if you will. Are there homework assignments to watch Heroes and XMen and go out and see I Am Legend? What's your source material that your students wrestle with, engage with in your classes?
That's a great question. This semester, we are ending the evolution class with XMen, precisely to ask these questions. How have the theories and the anxieties that respond to the theories found their way into popular culture? How do they find expression in the 21st century? And how do they change the theories in the process so that the public or the viewer's engagement with those theories might be mediated through our viewing of a film, whether we know it or not, our viewing of a film such as XMen?
Now, in class, does it come up about the swine flu outbreak? Because in a way, it's very contemporary, and swine flu has been particularly prominent on college campuses. Is the disease actually being worked into class because it is part of what's going on college campuses around the country?
It hasn't been so far. It has come up in my classes because students have been absent, unfortunately, who have come down with swine flu. But it hasn't come up as a topic related to the class material yet. I think there's a very good chance in the evolution class that it will as we move into the more contemporary material. Right now we're reading Charles Darwin. So we haven't yet found the opportunity. I suppose we could have, but we've been pretty focused on origin of species and what's going on in the text, and haven't really found the opportunity to connect it to swine flu.
Viewers are invited to join this conversation, to ask Professor Wald a question, comment on the Duke University Facebook page, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or email live@duke.edu. So, Professor Wald, give us a homework assignment here. If you had to say, here's one book or a book and a film to get your mind around how science fiction intersects with popular culture and science and things to look for, what would our homework assignment be?
I'll go with two films. One that's the outbreak narrative, and I took the term from the film Outbreak, 1995, Wolfgang, I'm blanking on his last name, the director, starring Dustin Hoffman. Can't get it. But starring Dustin Hoffman. And that's really the film that drew me in to asking this question, the questions I asked in Contagious at All. So 1995. The film Gattaca from 1997, I believe, is the one that I would probably start with to talk about genomics and the anxieties that surround the question of genomics. And Gattaca is about a world in which everybody, we don't need resumes anymore. We just need blood tests. Everybody's fate is determined, or is thought to be determined, by what's in their genes, what's in their DNA. And the hero is somebody who won't accept that, who is considered inferior in this culture because he hasn't been engineered. And the film touts itself as being about that there is no gene for the human spirit. So I see a lot of anxieties surrounding the question of what's called genetic determinism. That is, the fear that we will, as a culture, begin to think that we are so hardwired that everything we do, our behavior, our emotions, everything is it can be traced back to what lies in our genes. And this film reflects that anxiety and responds to it. So it's where I would begin a class, and where I do begin a class on genomics.
Professor Wald, a quick Google search has shown us that the director of Outbreak was Wolfgang Peterson.
Thank you. That's it.
And picking up on that, you mentioned that this was a pivotal movie for your own scholarship. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about how you evolved into studying science fiction from studying, I guess, more contemporary, more traditional literature? How did that evolve over time? That has
a very specific origin. A friend of mine who is very, very savvy was editing a collection of essays about American literature, and he asked me to write the chapter on science fiction. And I said to him, but I'm really not that interested in science fiction. I do medical thrillers, I do science and fiction, but I really am not that interested in what you would call science fiction. He said, oh, I think you are. So I took it on. I trusted him, and I took on the challenge, and I wrote the chapter, and I found I'm not only interested in science fiction, he was absolutely right. Thank you, Lenny Casuto. He knew me better than I knew myself. I am now obsessed with science fiction. And the reason is that what I have found is that science fiction, which really came of age as a genre in the post-World War II period in the United States, even though the term was coined in 1926, but it really, as a genre, comes into its own in the 40s and 50s. And it's very much grappling with the legacy of World War II. It's grappling, on the one hand, with the challenge to the notion of human being that is coming from the science and technology that were expedited during the course of the war. So genetics, cybernetics, cell biology, other things. And on the other hand, the challenges that are coming out of the geopolitical transformations that followed World War II, as well as social theorists' effort to understand why the Nazis had happened, why Hiroshima and Nagasaki had happened. In other words, to come to terms in a really deep and fundamental way with what it meant to be human. And I feel that there were challenges going on both in the sciences and in social thought and in geopolitics that all come together most profoundly in science fiction. It is the genre that, in my opinion, most theorizes, most analyzes those connections.
Very good. Professor Wald, as we begin to wrap up the office hours here, what would you say to a student in high school or college, maybe likes to read but is trying to find out what the interest in reading means? What does it mean to be a professor? How do you study books? What's your advice to someone just seeking in that way?
What's my advice, not in terms of specific books, but my advice to someone who is passionate about reading?
Yes.
My first advice is keep reading, but also read as widely and as broadly as you possibly can, because there are areas of interest that you don't even know that you have. So keep your mind open to not only to books, but to films, to video games, to every kind of medium that we have available to us at this moment, and every subject that they cover. And really let your imagination fly, and let it carry you to places that you haven't dreamed of yet.
This conversation can continue. Post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or send an email to live@duke.edu. To learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.